Hi guys, it's Owen here from D20. I think it's time we have another one of my videos about my unpopular opinions. And this time I'm gonna start with one, and if there's enough time, I'll get onto the second one of my two different unpopular opinions. And my first one is that when it comes to prequels, sequels, remakes, and reboots, I like them. There seems to be a popular opinion, meme, zeitgeist that you'll find online. Here's some examples. That Hollywood is growing stale, that there's a problem in the film industry, that all we're seeing is remakes and reboots and sequels and prequels. All we're seeing is the same characters and the same plots being regurgitated over and over again, and this is somehow a problem. This is a big issue that is going to kill Hollywood. Well, I hate to break it to you guys. It's not. It's neither an issue nor is it going to kill Hollywood, because remakes, prequels, reboots, and sequels, that's what Hollywood is made of, and it has been from the beginning. And it goes back further back than Hollywood, I'm afraid. It goes back all the way to the beginning. The very oldest examples we have of performed literature is probably, when I say performed literature, I mean not written literature. The written literature, the oldest example we have of that is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a poem which is part of the larger work, the Enuma Elish, dates back to about 2100 BC, which is just over 4,000 years ago. But that was just written. As far as we know, that wasn't performed. Might have been, we don't know. But performed literature goes back to about the 5th century BC, so that's 400 to 500 BC, and we're talking about the Dionysia festival in ancient Greece. So this was a festival that happened every year in Athens, where people would come to the giant theater there in the middle of Athens, and they would sit and watch some plays. Typically there would be 5 plays as part of a competition, and then the writer and director of each of those plays, they would compete with one another, and one of them would be the winner. And in the year 458 BC, the winning play was the Orestia trilogy, which was written by Aeschylus. But there's a keyword right there, trilogy, right? So this was 3 plays: an original, a sequel, and another sequel. Sequels go all the way back there, but it gets better, because these plays we're talking about, the Orestia trilogy, the 3 parts were Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides. They themselves were a sequel to Homer's Iliad. This has been going on from the beginning, all the way back to the beginning of literature. I mean, we look at the Enuma Elish. We don't have any other pre-written stories or documents that go back further back than the Enuma Elish, than the Epic of Gilgamesh. But odds are it didn't just spontaneously arise out of nowhere. It probably is the recording of an oral tradition that goes back even further, probably more thousands of years. And this is a story that's been evolving over centuries or millennia, being told from one generation to the next, being revised, being updated, being rebooted, being sequelized and prequelized, recreated, until eventually it formed the version that we see in those clay tablets from 4,200 years ago. And it didn't stop there. That same story is being reworked and retold and rebooted and prequeled and sequeled even today. There are parts of that story, the Enuma Elish, which we see retold in things like Star Wars, the original Star Wars, The Matrix, Harry Potter, all of these kinds of things. These same story elements that were introduced all the way back there, we're still telling those same stories over and over again. And it's not because we're just not original, because we can't come up with new ideas. It's because we love these stories. These stories tell us something not about the world, but about ourselves. That's what myths are. That's what set myths apart from other kinds of stories that don't last, that myths are enduring and timeless. We go to the theater over and over and over again to see the same myth retold to us over and over in different versions, with the details tweaked and with different recreations, because it's satisfying at some kind of deep subconscious level to have those stories told back to us, so that we can understand ourselves more fully, so that we can aspire to the best parts of ourselves, or that we can learn to understand the worst parts of ourselves, so that we can try and make conceptual sense out of the world around us. I know it's something of a cliche on the internet these days, but Jordan B. Peterson, the Canadian psychologist, he talks a lot about the importance of myth in developing the human psyche, and it's fascinating. I enjoy listening to what he has to say about it. I've also mentioned before Robert M. Price, who's a biblical and superhero scholar and a scholar of H.P. Lovecraft. He also talks a lot about the parallels between those different forms of literature or different examples of literature and what they have in common and what they tell us about ourselves, about who we are as people, as a species, as a culture, all of those kinds of things. All of those things are embedded in the myths, in the literature. And that's why we like to hear them over and over again, because we're hearing stories about ourselves, not about these conceptual, fictional creatures. And that's why I'm okay with it. So let me use an example. Star Trek, the original series, began in 1966, lasted for 3 seasons. It was cancelled twice. It survived the first cancelling and then was cancelled again. There was an animated series that came out for a couple of years in the early 70s, but that doesn't really count. It wasn't a remake. It was just adapting the same content for children. It was terrible. Sorry. The writing was great because a lot of the writers that worked on the original series also worked on the animated series, so there were some really good story concepts in there, but the production quality was awful. It's barely watchable. There was film adaptations starting with the motion picture. There were 6 more movies after that with the original series cast. And then we started to see The Next Generation. Star Trek The Next Generation started in 1987. There was a bit of overlap between the film series and the Next Generation series in terms of the release order. But as soon as The Next Generation started to come out, Star Trek fans, about half of us, were up in arms. Because this new thing, this isn't the Star Trek that we recognize. It's completely different. My childhood is ruined. Everything about it is ruinous. But the other half of Star Trek fans were like, oh crap, this is awesome. This is, not only is it familiar enough to the original Star Trek that we can see the things about that Star Trek in it that we still loved, but it's different enough that it can explore new ideas and new interesting notions, maybe recover the same ideas and the same story elements, but from different angles, taking different perspectives on it. In other words, it allows us to explore the world and our perceptions and ourselves in new and interesting ways. There was a similar outcry when Deep Space Nine came out in the early 80s. Then again when Voyager came out a couple of years after that. Then when Star Trek Enterprise came out a few years after that. And there was an even bigger outcry in 2009 when J.J. Abrams released his rebooted movie simply called Star Trek. And then it happened again a few months back when Star Trek Discovery came out on CBS All Access. This is a thing that keeps happening within the Star Trek community, and the Star Trek community is not alone. It keeps happening in fandom in general. Whenever some new version, some deviated version of a thing comes out, about half the fans freak out. How dare they change this thing that I love? And I'm like, holy crap, this is awesome. This is more of the thing that I love. Another example you might recognize is in the Star Wars franchise. Ever since the original 3 films came out in the 70s and 80s, every new Star Wars film that has come out has garnered both critical acclaim and critical rejection from the Star Wars fan community. Plenty of Star Wars fans have said, no, A Phantom Menace ruined my experience forever. I'll never watch another new Star Wars movie again. And plenty of Star Wars fans were like, well, this is pretty cool. It's not the Star Wars that I recognize, but it's still Star Wars, so I'm going to keep enjoying it. That was certainly my perspective, and it was of a lot of the true fans that I know and I'm familiar with. And the same thing has kept happening. Every time there's been a new movie, that there's been that same kind of response. Plenty of people have said, oh, this is crap, this is trash, it's the worst Star Wars movie, it's ruined the franchise for me. And others have said, well, this is a cool new thing. It's not without its problems, but it's pretty awesome. I enjoyed it. It seems to me that the only franchise that appears to be almost completely immune to this is the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. At least in terms of the films. The TV series, there's a bit more mess around there, but the films, I think it's 21 films that have come out in the series so far, each one's been more popular than the last, and it has yet to falter. But it's coming. It's gonna one of these days. There's gonna be a movie that's not going to live up to all the hype that the fans are generating, and it's going to disappoint half of its fan base because that's just unavoidable. But this is what it is. It's sequels and prequels and remakes and reboots. These things are all it does is allow us to re-examine that same material over and over again, but from different angles and from different perspectives. Like for example, the 2009 Star Trek reboot. I don't really like that term reboot because it suggests that it's restarting the universe from scratch, which it didn't do. It kind of did, but not really. If you've seen the movie, you kind of know what I mean. It's a time travel story. Spock travels back from the early 25th century to the mid 23rd century by accident, and it spawns this new divergent timeline where things are slightly different. The characters that we recognize are different in some ways. Instead of Kirk Prime, the original James T. Kirk from the original timeline, the crucible that turned him into the person that he was the fact that he survived the Holocaust of Tarsus 4. In this new timeline, the Kelvin timeline, that didn't happen, or at least not that we're aware of. We don't, as far as we know, Kirk wasn't present at Tarsus 4 when there was a Holocaust, or maybe the Holocaust never happened. We don't know anything about Tarsus 4, but we do know that in this new timeline called the Kelvin timeline, Kirk was an orphan, which was a different kind of crucible. So he had a very different upbringing, but it resulted in two characters that are very similar in a lot of ways because they're still the same underlying guy, but their experiences have differed significantly. So the character turns out quite differently, and that in itself is fascinating. It allows us to explore that notion of nature versus nurture. What portion of us is baked in, and what portion of us arises out of upbringing. That's fascinating, and let's keep doing that. Let's keep making more movies. They've just announced that they're making a fourth movie in the Kelvin timeline, which is now concurrent with Star Trek Discovery, which is a TV series set in the original timeline. So now we're seeing two different Star Trek timelines being pursued at the same time, which is amazing. But not all is sunshine and roses. There are obviously examples of prequels and sequels and remakes and reboots that don't turn out that well. Let me think of an example. So there was an animated series came out a few years ago called Beware the Batman, which was pretty cool. It was a CGI animated series. The visual style seemed to be strongly inspired by the 1990s Bruce Timm animated series, but with a few tweaks. What I found was interesting is the way that they changed the storyline. So Batman was pretty much constant. He was pretty much the same. They changed the Alfred character quite a lot. So instead of being this prim and proper buttoned up butler guy that we're familiar with, they made him this sort of rough and tumble former special forces kind of guy who wasn't really the butler. He was Batman's partner who was just disguised as Bruce Wayne's butler. It was a bit odd, but it was fine. I thought it kind of worked. The Joker didn't appear in the series at all, which I'm kind of okay with. I'm a bit jokered out at the moment. We've seen so many versions of the Joker, especially in the last 20 years or so, that I'm okay with there being a version of Batman that doesn't have Joker present. But instead, Batman's arch nemesis was Anarchy, who's an established DC character, but they changed the character quite a lot. They made him sort of a kind of an evil Batman in a white suit, which is quite different to the version of Anarchy that we've seen in the comics, and he also made an appearance in the Arrowverse. But it was also kind of okay. Probably the biggest change they made was that they took Robin out of the series completely and replaced him with Katana. So Katana, you might remember from Suicide Squad movie. She also appeared in the Arrowverse. This is a very different character that in the comics has very little to do with Batman at all. Why they would make her Batman's sidekick instead of Robin is very strange. Now these kinds of changes, they're interesting in and of themselves, but what I find is, the way I feel about this kind of stuff is, if you're creating a reimagined version of a storyline and you're making significant changes to the character, or to the story, or to the cast of characters, you can't. That's fine. That's not inherently a problem. But if you're making significant changes, you kind of need to justify why those changes have been made. There needs to be a good reason why we have Katana instead of Robin. And as far as I can tell, in Beware the Batman, there weren't any. They just never explained it. Now, to be fair, it was cancelled after the first season, or maybe it made a second season. I watched it all the way to the end, and at no point did they ever explain why Robin wasn't there and why Katana was there instead. Perhaps they were planning to explore that as an idea in a future season, and they just never got around to it. They got cancelled first, but that kind of tells you something about it, doesn't it? I mean, the people who, the target audience of this show wanted to know why Robin wasn't there, and they weren't answering the question, and when they didn't answer the question, the fans just left. It didn't grab the audience's attention the way that they had hoped, which is a pity because it could have been cool. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I think that there's a core principle here that needs to be laid out, and that is when you're making changes to a character or to a franchise, when you're rebooting it or restarting it or extending it in some way, the new version needs to be respectful of the tone and the kind of the character that was there before. something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they're very, very good at doing this. So they're an adaptation of previous material that existed mostly in the comic books. Some of the characters have appeared in TV shows and movies and that kind of stuff before, but it's drawing primarily its material from the comic books, and it's respectful of that material. So the character adaptations are very similar to how they appear in the comics, both physically and in terms of their characterizations. The storylines that they're exploring in the MCU are derived from the comic book stories, enough so that those of us who love those stories can recognize the elements that are derived from those, but they're different enough so that they're still interesting and surprising and exciting to watch. And that's great. That's exactly what you want. Again, the Star Trek Kelvin timeline movies, there've now been 3 of them. They've done the same sort of thing. Although it's exploring a new a facet of the universe, there are enough links back to the original content to show those of us who are interested that, listen guys, we're not going off the reservation here. This is still Star Trek, and we still love Star Trek. We're basing it on that original material, but we're exploring new avenues. There are enough of those subtle links beneath the surface to satisfy even the most discerning of fans, of which I probably am one, that they're not just ignoring all of this, the context and all of the legacy that exists. They're showing respect for all of that kind of stuff. But the thing that inspired me to make this video today is a thing that I saw on Twitter a day or two ago, which it kind of really upset me. And it upset me probably more than it should. And I can't shake this fact that I'm probably overreacting to it, because I normally don't react this way to this kind of thing, but goddamn, it hurt my feelings. And that is this. Yeah. So when I was 6 years old, I loved the Thundercats. I had 2 different Lion-O action figures. I had the full-size one with the glowing eyes. It had like a ring thing that you pressed into a little notch on his back, and his eyes would light up, and then there was a button you would press and his arm would go like this. He would swing the sword. I had another little version who was just a cool little like collectible version. I had the sword itself. You put batteries and you press the button and the gem would light up, and I would run around the house going thunder, thunder, thunder cats. It was awesome. Like I was Lion-O. I inhabited that space. I found this really cool artwork of Lion-O on I don't know, Pinterest or something the other day. Which I thought would make a really cool idea for a cosplay. So I added it to my cosplay pipeline idea pipeline as something that I might want to look at wearing to a con next year sometime. But then I was really, really sad when this Thundercats Roar thing came out. It made me sad. Because what this has done is, yes, it's a remake, but it appears, from what I can tell, to be completely disrespectful of the original. Now, there was another Thundercats remake in 2011, I think it was, which was the most underrated animated series that came out that year. It was actually really good. The production value was high. It was, although it had a completely revamped sort of aesthetic feel to it, it was still respectful of the original. You've got that they sort of did scene by scene recreations of some of it, but they took the storyline in much more interesting directions. The storytelling and the characterization was more sophisticated than it had been in the 80s, but still was convincing enough to be a retelling of those same characters and that same sort of mythic theme. Thundercats Roar doesn't look like it's going to be that. Now, granted, it hasn't started yet. All we've seen is this trailer, but based on the trailer, I'm not going to watch it. I can't bring myself to do that. It hurts my feelings, because this Lion-O, compared to this Lion-O, this is not the same character. This is not a respectful recreation of the thing. Now, you might argue that fictional characters are just ideas. They're not real people. They're not deserving of respect. And I'm sympathetic to that view. I feel the same is true of a lot of sort of conceptual ideas. But when you're talking about a beloved character, yes, sure, that character doesn't exist in the same way that you or I do. It's not a flesh and blood person, but it does exist in a kind of a different way, in a hypothetical way, and in an archetypal way, in that character embodies certain elements of who we are. It's an amalgam. It's an ideal. It's an archetype of idealized humanity. And to disrespect that character is to disrespect that part in ourselves. And that's what this looks like. That this version of Lion-O is disrespectful of the original. It's disrespectful of the original Thundercats, and it's disrespectful of the parts of ourselves that we saw in those original Thundercats and that original Lion-O. I think that's why it hurts my feelings so much. Now, this isn't the first time that this has happened. I mean, there was a show that came out a few years ago, Teen Titans Go. Now, I'm in two minds about Teen Titans Go. I felt a similar way, although I wasn't. My feelings weren't as hurt by Teen Titans Go as it is with Thundercats Roar. It was also kind of disrespectful of those same characters. On the other hand, it brought those characters to a whole new audience who hadn't experienced the Teen Titans before, who hadn't read the comics in the 80s and 90s, who hadn't seen the earlier Teen Titans animated series and Young Justice and those sorts of things. They were attracted to this new show because it was superheroes, but it had this really cartoony style. And then through that, they've been introduced to the wider sort of Teen Titans and DC Comics universe. Okay, I get it as sort of a gateway thing. But Thundercats Roar, there is no wider universe to explore there. All they've done is they've taken its own very limited fictional universe and they've just turned it inside out. They've turned it into a thing that it wasn't before. And it makes me sick. I don't like it. It gives me the same feeling as the Ghostbusters remake, the 2016, 2017, whenever it was. It's just, you're taking a thing that already existed, a much beloved entertainment franchise, and instead of reimagining it and recreating it, you're applying something new to it. You're making it into a thing that it wasn't before, but not in a new or interesting way, in a disrespectful way, in a bad way. And it's gross. I don't know. What do you think? Are you going to watch Thundercats Roar? Are your feelings as hurt by it as mine are? Now, I'm not the only one who has strong feelings about this. You might have seen this video by some black guy. Or you might have seen this tweet also by some black guy, which pretty much sums up how I feel about it as well. So yeah, in summary, I'm generally in favor of remakes, reboots, prequels, and sequels. Not only do I think they're a good idea, I think that we can't have literature without them. But if you're going to do it, you need to be respectful of the source material. You need to be able to demonstrate that not only have you paid attention to what existed in the source material, but that you care about it as much as the people that you're presenting this material to. All right, I have strong feelings about this, but this video has already gone on too long, so I'm going to call it there. I'm probably going to do a follow-up to this at some point because I have lots to say about things like DC's Legends of Tomorrow and X-Men 3, The Last Stand, which, yeah, okay. But I'll save that for another time. That's it for now. Swat out.